All right, so you're one of the lucky few who found this channel, wondering what it's all about. Well, most people who talk to me seem to think it's about trashing John Dehlin. And while it is very fun, and while I'll probably come back to doing that in the future, it's actually not the reason I made this channel. And I was actually going to go over the reasons today. One reason I was going to go over is that there's a lot of anti-woke sentiment going around. And while I am against this woke nonsense, I guess I got to explain it. I don't think an anti-identity is an identity at all. It's kind of like for anybody who's walked away from their church, being against that church is not an identity. You have to, if you're against something, you can have very good reasons to be against it, but you have to sort of realize what those reasons are, or else you don't really have any valid criticisms. You have to stand on a principle, and you have to be able to articulate what principle is being violated. So if you're against wokeness, you got to articulate what principle that you stand on that wokeness violates, that any of this violates. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today. The principle that I hold very close to me that they violate is Western liberalism, namely individualism and meritocracy. These are things that they actually call out in their literature. I read through White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, and she outwardly criticizes the idea of meritocracy and the idea of individualism. Now, what is individualism? Well, in a nutshell, it's the idea that the individual is the primary unit of society, the primary unit that ought to be protected by the law. And I like this video that kind of explains it pretty well.
Is that we actually value the individual, right? The individual has intrinsic value in Western societies. Do you know how long it took people to formulate that as an idea, and how unlikely that idea is? That poor you, useless, powerless you, with all your damn faults, you're actually worth something. You're worth something to the point that the law has to respect you. God, we don't want to abandon that for some half-witted collectivism, which we're doing as rapidly as possible, because one of the things that characterizes the radical left types is they don't give a damn about you as an individual or about individuals at all. You're black or you're white or you're Latino or you're transsexual or you're homosexual or whatever. You're a group. You're a member of a group, and the only thing that matters is the group. Well, I can tell you, if the only thing that matters is the group, you bloody well don't matter very much. And then you got to ask yourself just exactly what sort of people are trying to set things up so it is that the individual doesn't matter very much. Well, it's the sort of people to whom the individual doesn't matter very much. And I might suggest that you don't elect them, and that when they attempt to take power, that you do everything you can to stop them.
No, I'm going to stop it right there. I love the way that he frames that. It sounds like such an obvious sort of redundancy. What kind of people use those ideologies? Well, I mean, it's the people who do not have respect for individuals, that see you as what you are rather than who you are. You are a black man, you are a white man, you are a cisgender woman, whatever it may be. Now, another ideology that I'm pretty critical of, as far as my capacity to be critical of it, gets me. I'm still pretty new to the idea of postmodernism. I've been reading about it. Everything I have learned about it so far, I've been very highly critical of. One of those reasons, the principle on which I stand that is incongruent with postmodernism is the idea of objective truth, is the idea that we can approximately reach something resembling objective truth. We can rely on our senses in that much. Now, postmodernism, one of its key tenets is radical skepticism. And that might sound appealing to those of us who left religion, but it's not skepticism in the way of like the skeptic community. This is skepticism of everything down to your senses. You have to be skeptical of what your senses are telling you. I don't know, if you took it to its logical conclusion, it's, how do I know that the earth is round? Well, I don't, because everything that brought to my mind the knowledge that the earth is round, I ought to be skeptical of. Everything that brought to my mind the knowledge that I exist, that I am in this room, that everyone around me exists, I ought to be skeptical of. Now, most people don't take it that far. The original postmodernists kind of tried to, they said they did, but I don't think there's any real way to take it that far. Anyway, this is another Jordan Peterson interview, and it's actually the guy he talks to that explained it really well. And
if you put the group before the individual, then all of that disappears. Like
Yes.
when you're
Yeah.
when you're debating with the radical leftist postmodern types about free speech, you're actually not debating with them about free speech because they don't believe in free speech. It's not part of their conceptual universe, because for speech to be free and therefore valuable, the people conducting the conversation have to be sovereign individuals capable of generating independent thought, independent of their canonical group identity, and reach a consensus through that process of dialogue. None of that exists in the postmodern world. All of those preconceptions would be attributed to, well, something like Eurocentric neocolonialism.
right here he's making the case that something as foundational to liberal society as freedom of speech, somebody super woke could take it and use, the lens of post-colonial theory to say that, well, freedom of speech is a white-centric, post-colonial, neoliberal ideal, or whatever it is. It'll try to make the very idea of freedom of speech sound oppressive by virtue of being constructed in a white supremacist system. It's always the system. And anything that was constructed in an oppressive system is evil. And now a lot of people don't believe that. A lot of people say that, who are you talking to? Who says stupid shit like that? Well, here's a good example of somebody saying stupid shit like that. Now, this is a few years ago. This talking about race, talking about whiteness. This thing was put out by the Smithsonian, actually. And I'll just read it here. Now, this was, they did retract it because it's clearly so insulting to, well, everyone. I'd say it's mostly insulting to non-white people because this says like a lot of good things are white-centric. It says the white dominant culture, or whiteness, refers to ways white people and their traditions, attitudes, and ways of life have been normalized over time and are now considered standard practices in the United States. And since white people still hold most of the institutional power in America, see, that's the erasure of the individual, right? Because white person, that I qualify as a white person. Also, I don't hold any institutional power. So you have to get rid of me as an individual in order to say, okay, white dudes hold all the institutional power. Jared is a white dude, so there we go. We have all internalized some aspects of white culture, including people of color. Now, these are all aspects of white culture. I'm not kidding you. Like things like, well, here it is: individualism, self-reliance. You get what you deserve. Like individuals assume to be in control of their environment. What an insane world to live in, to where like the oppressors are the ones telling you that, yeah, you can do this. You are in some amount of control of the things that happen to you. Family structure, the nuclear family, husband is the breadwinner, blah, blah, blah. Right here, this is where it's got to be insulting. Like if I were a black dude, I'd be so pissed off by this. I mean, I'm a white dude. I'm already pissed off about it. Emphasis on scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking, cause and effect relationships, quantitative emphasis. Again, the ideology of the oppressors, this whiteness, puts an emphasis on rational thinking. What do you do to combat that? You say, no, don't think rationally. Throw it away because it was the white dudes that told us to think rationally. They go over some things here that are pretty banal, things like Christianity is a norm. Well, of course it is in America. Most religious people in America are Christian. That's fine with me. Don't worry about it. As long as they're not trying to put it in schools or whatever, I'm fine. Future orientation, planning for future, delayed gratification. Progress is always best. Tomorrow will be better. Oh, optimism now, huh? That tomorrow will be better. Now, optimism is a symptom of white supremacy. I love this because it feels it legitimately feels like it was written by actual white supremacists, people who legitimately, not in the Robin DiAngelo sense of the word. This feels like it was written by people who really, white people who really believe they're better than all other races. Because like, here are some things that we do. We're the science dudes. We're future oriented. Anyway, I just wanted to go over that to point out that while a lot of people might think that what Jordan Peterson was pointing to was a fringe type of example, it's gone as high as the Smithsonian. And luckily they retracted that and said, yeah, sorry, black people, sorry, non-white people, that we said all these good things on accident about white people. We'll do better next time.
Well, it seems to me that what's at work in that is a radical dismissal of the possibility that the individual has access to anything at all. That is to say if you don't, the belief in free speech is fundamentally motivated or sustained by the confidence that our discourse, our dialogue, that human thinking itself can reach something stable, that it has a relationship beyond, beyond immediacy, and that therefore,
and beyond power,
it reaches beyond power to truth. There's no point in ever having a conversation about anything if the conversation itself doesn't have access to something transcendent.
That's exactly right.
I enjoyed what he said right there quite a bit. There's no point in having a conversation at all if the conversation doesn't have access to truth. That's basically my biggest beef with something like postmodernism, is it assumes that we don't have access to truth. Now, you get into the new applied postmodernist stuff, and they get a little bit weird with it, assuming that you have access to, well, the truth that oppression exists, but I'm not going to get into that here. Mainly what I was wanting to talk about was that radical skepticism, that overly skeptical attitude where you're skeptical of everything, all the way down to your ability to know things at all. It's just sort of a spiral of nihilism. And the last thing I was going to touch on was, as proof that the intent of this channel is always to be about these concepts like individualism, I named it Saint of the Pyre. And the reason behind that is, well, one of my favorite book excerpts of all time. If a lot of my friends catch wind of this, I'll get shit, but I don't care. It's Anthem by Ayn Rand, one of my favorite books ever. Now, in Anthem, the point of the book is to sort of illustrate the logical conclusion of collectivism. If you just look at life through purely collective lens. Now, the main character, his name is Equality. I don't remember the number, but his Equality and then a number. They all have numbers in their names because they're not supposed to be. You're not supposed to put any individual above any other individual. It's all the collective. Now he's always stood out a little bit because he's just a little bit taller than everyone else. They've kind of tried to biologically engineer people to be the same height, but he's just a little bit taller, so people already look at him a little bit weird. So that's probably why he has this sort of window into I'm something kind of different. And it's going to sound a little bit odd because the grammar is a little off. The reason the grammar is off is because this society has basically abolished any grammar that is singular in any way. The word I is never present. When the main character refers to himself, he says we. There is some word, one single word, which is not in the language of men, but which had been. And this is the unspeakable word, which no man may speak nor hear. But sometimes, and it is rare, sometimes, somewhere, one among men find that word. They find it upon scraps of old manuscripts or cut into the fragments of ancient stones. But when they speak it, they are put to death. There is no crime punished by death in this world, save the one crime of speaking the unspeakable word. We have seen one of such men burned alive in the square of the city, and it was a sight which has stayed with us through the years, and it haunts us and follows us, and it gives us no rest. We were a child then, 10 years old, and we had stood in the great square with all the children and all the men of the city, sent to behold the burning. They brought the transgressor out into the square, and they led them to the pyre. They had torn out the tongue of the transgressor, so they could speak no longer. The transgressor were young and tall. They had hair of gold and eyes blue as morning. They walked to the pyre, and their step did not falter. And of all the faces in the square, of all the faces which shrieked and screamed and spat curses upon them, theirs was the calmest and happiest face. As the chains were wound over their body at the stake, and a flame set to the pyre, the transgressor looked upon the city. There was a thin thread of blood running from the corner of their mouth, but their lips were smiling. And a monstrous thought came to us then, which has never left us. We had heard of saints. There are the saints of labor, and the saints of the councils, and the saints of the great rebirth. But we had never seen a saint, nor what the likeness of a saint should be. And we thought then, standing in the square, that the likeness of a saint was the face we saw before us in the flames, the face of the transgressor of the unspeakable word. As the flames rose, a thing happened which no eyes saw but ours, else we would not be living today. Perhaps it had only seemed to us, but it seemed to us that the eyes of the transgressor had chosen us from the crowd, and were looking straight upon us. There was no pain in their eyes, and no knowledge of the agony of their body. There was only joy in them, and pride, a pride holier than is fit for human pride to be. And it seemed as if these eyes were trying to tell us something through the flames, to send into our eyes some word without sound. And it seemed as if those eyes were begging us to gather that word, and not to let it go from us and from the earth. But the flames rose, and we could not guess the word. What, even if we had to burn for it like the saint of the pyre? What is the unspeakable word? That's one of my all-time favorite excerpts from a book, and it might sound a little bit conceited to name my channel after it, but whatever. I'm an arrogant bastard. I read Ayn Rand. Of course I'm an arrogant bastard. Get over it. Now, I think the reason that I loved that excerpt so much was because I was already pretty individualistic as a person. I was already pretty sold on the idea of individualism, but there was something in the way, and you saw it in that first Jordan Peterson clip, there was something in the way Ayn Rand spoke of that she was like a complete atheist, but that she held that word, she held the word I as the unspeakable word, the word of the individual. She held that to be as sacred and something that you ought to be grateful that those that came before you passed down, because they didn't have to. And it's pretty miraculous that any society could have ever become individualistic, and any society could have ever decided to govern by consent. It's pretty amazing. You have to be pretty grateful for it. And it was brought to us by certain giants, and most of what postmodernism, wokeness, all this stuff does is tell us to spit on the backs of those giants. Anyway, that's all I was really going to talk about today. Just remember to continue hating yourself for being straight, white, cis men who uphold the patriarchy and benefit from white supremacy.
I hate the fact that I'm a straight white male.